final round of Norway chess took place today. Magnus Carlsen had already won the tournament, but he had a tricky last round game against Levon Aronian, another fighting player. So let's take a look and see what happened. Don't forget to like, comment, share and subscribe. And do consider helping us out by donating via PayPal or Patreon. Check out the rewards on Patreon, extra videos, newsletter, that kind of thing. Okay, on with the game. Carlsen with the white pieces. So would he play solidly? Would he play something wacky? No, it's pretty orthodox. It's d4 and Aronian goes for a queen's gambit declined. Carlsen plays the exchange variation. He does enjoy fixed pawn structures. And he's played this line before. In fact, he had exactly this line against Nakamura earlier in the year. Traditionally, it was thought that this was actually a pretty dull way for white to play. If white castles, well, you don't have very much here. But h4 is Carlsen's move. So it looks like he wanted to be creative today. Earlier in the year, Nakamura had played knight b6 against him, and they had a fascinating game that finally ended in a draw. It seems that Aronian came prepared, and he played something new. Pawn to a5. Now that means that if Carlsen is going to castle queenside, then this pawn can just kind of advance down the board and perhaps open up the position. So, yeah, not a bad idea at all. And Carlsen thought for about 5 minutes and played king f1. Okay, so he's being creative. And then a4 anyway from Aronian. It kind of fixes the pawn here. And certainly advancing the a pawn doesn't harm black's structure in any way. a3 stops the pawn advancing again. And queen b6 attacks the pawn on b2, queen c2. And then h5 from Aronian. So he's just making sure that Carlsen is never going to get in h5 himself. And here, well, if white wants to play in kind of a fairly orthodox way, and I think a pretty decent position, you can just go g3 and king g2 and connect the rooks. I'd say it's about equal, but there's lots of play there. But Carlsen thought for about 7.5 minutes. He wanted to be creative. Played bishop g5. Okay, let's see his idea. Castle's kingside. Now knight e5. So it seems as though he still has ambitions on the kingside. Well, first things first, he's threatening to take here and take on e7. Aronian played rook e8. Good move, just guarding the bishop. And in any case, that's where the rook belongs in these positions on the semi-open file. Now, of course, g6 could be taken here, but in fact, black's king is safe enough. And black can always block on h7 with the knight. So knight g6 isn't working, basically. But Carlsen took on f6 and played rook h3. So if this sack is going to work, you need another piece to help the queen. So it looks as though he wants to bring the rook into play and then go for a sack. So interesting. So Aronian has to react, and he did so very well. He played queen b3. Obviously, if the queens are exchanged, there's no attack. Now, Carlsen decided he wanted to keep the queens on the board. He wanted to try and get something here. He played queen b1. He could just exchange, and this endgame is roughly level. But he played queen b1. So he's still looking as though he wants to get in on g6. But actually, Aronian's next move is excellent. Knight e4. Perhaps Carlsen underestimated this move. He thought for 7.5 minutes here. But really, he has to take it. And then really he has to take that pawn. Now, what's the point of giving up this pawn? Well, Aronian played bishop d6. Good move. White's problem here is that the king's a little bit exposed. So a check on b5 could be possible. And b2 might be captured as well. And of course, now that there's a pin here, then knight g6 is ruled out. And here, well, white just has to compromise. And it's not so easy. You know, the rooks don't look very good now that they're not working together. They're split. There you go. You can tick the PowerPlayChess bingo card. Split rooks. Not good for white. If white is ambitious, well, it's actually not ambitious really. It's just foolish and protects that knight. Then it's possible just to take on b2. And actually, this is just way too dangerous for white. The king is too exposed. That a pawn is dangerous. Okay, let's go back. So Carlsen played rook g3. Bishop takes knight. Pawn takes. Queen b5, check. King went to g1. And rook takes e5. So there's certainly no attack for white. And actually white has to be very careful here because black can take control of the position with his major pieces. Queen f6. So Carlsen is hanging on to that b pawn. Rook f5. Queen d4. By this stage, I think Carlsen would have been very happy with the draw. If rook d5, then they're just going to repeat the position. But Aronian wanted more. He played queen e2. In fact, I think queen d5 might be even better. It's basically taking control over the d file. But queen e2 also gives black some initiative. Attacking the b pawn, rook b1. Queen c2 attacks the rook. So queen d3 is forced. And then rook c5, queen takes queen, rook takes queen. Well, you can see that black has the advantage here, just because his rook is more active. Black's queenside pawns look very healthy. The pawn on b2 doesn't look very nice. So Carlsen decides, okay, I'm going to exchange some pawns, get rid of that pawn on b2. b5, rook d3, the rook comes in from the cold and claims the d file. That's important before the black rook comes over. Pawn takes pawn on b3, rook b3, and now rook a4, attacking the pawn on e4. Black is better. The rook on c2 is very well placed on the 7th rank, and black has this queenside pawn majority. It still should be tenable for white. It's uncomfortable, but it looks like f3 is the best move. And the idea is this, that after rook c4, king h2. Now black ideally wants to double on the 7th rank. But the problem is this, that if rook a2, then rook c3, and white equalizes. So f3 still looks uncomfortable. I can understand why Carlsen didn't want to do that, because it exposes the 2nd rank or the 7th rank. But it looks like it's holding. Instead, he played rook c3, forcing an exchange of rooks. But this is still better for black. Queenside pawn majority. In this case, it's actually very strong, because it's not possible for the white king to come over. If we could somehow magically put the king on e3, then I think white would be fine here. But in this case, you can't bring the king over, and that means black will bring the king over to support those pawns, and then it's really dangerous. Let's see. f3, king f8 from Aronian, well played. King e7 from Aronian. King marching over. You can see Carlsen's king is way offside here. King e6. King is going to march through the middle. Rook d3 and rook c4. King g3, king e5. rook d7, and now rook c3. Aronian is happy to go in for this race because these pawns can be very easily supported by the king, and they're going to be faster than white's passed pawns, basically. Nevertheless, if white plays rook e7, that's the best chance, actually, and still seems like this is tenable. After this, and this is very subtle, but either the king will go in front of the c-pawn and block the c-pawn, or it goes here, and in the race the king's kind of the wrong side. So rook e7 might be a better chance than Carlsen's rook a7. f6, rook a8. And here Aronian blunders. Well, blunders is a strong word. He makes an inaccuracy. He decides to play the king over here to force the rook away from defending the a-pawn. Instead, it would have been better to play rook b3, making way for the c-pawn and get the king to just support that c-pawn as it advances. But, well, it is very complicated, but it does seem like a better move. Instead, king d6 played. King f4. So here we can see Aronian moving the king across to b7. g4. Carlsen hurries to create counterplay on the king's side. He desperately needs a pass pawn. King b7. Now, Carlsen is not going to send the rook up here. Instead, rook g8. Pawn takes pawn, pawn takes pawn, and now rook takes a3. So it's turned into a race, and this is really scary. One false move, and you can lose this one, basically. Carlsen plays rook f6. He should have played rook g7 check. So let's have a look at this. So I repeat, in the game he played rook f6. Rook g7 check should draw, and here's why. If king b6, rook g8 with the idea rook b8 check, and then you start advancing your pawns. That white rook needs to be behind the pawns. So for example, rook a7. And here, actually, if the rook blocks, you can exchange and the king comes back and then that one rolls home. And if king a5, well, e5. And the rook is doing a very good job here, and then white obviously has counterplay with these pawns. Should be a draw. So rook g7 check basically forces the king up the board. It's the same story with king a6, rook g8. And, well, there's potential threats on a8 or b8 to stop those pawns. So that's the important move, rook g7 check. Instead, Carlsen took on f6, eager to create some passed pawns. But after this, b3. Now the pawn is too far advanced. Let's see the difference. Rook f7 check. King b6. Rook f8, and here rook a7 is a winning move. This is completely different because after rook b8 you can interpose with a rook. After the exchange, because the pawn is on b3, it's just rolling home basically. So Carlsen played rook d8, but now he's lost. Pawn number 2 comes up to assist its brother, and here we go. c4. And here, if very, very nice tactic actually. Here Aronian played rook d1. Carlsen played rook d1. If he played instead king d2, then b2, we drag the king to b1, and a nice discovered check, and king takes rook. So instead, Carlsen played rook d1, but now the pawn advanced. And king c5, king d3, and here actually Carlsen resigned. Yeah, let's just continue on another move. We can play king here. And if necessary, you can check the king away and then advance these pawns. Game over. So Aronian did it. Aronian beat Carlsen. As I saw someone say on Twitter, yeah, when was the last time that Carlsen lost 2 games in a classical chess tournament? I haven't looked it up yet, but yeah, that's incredible. So he won the tournament and yet he lost two classical games. Two games. That's quite incredible. But it was a curious game. I mean, I think Levon did extremely well to win this endgame. But Magnus, he wasn't all there today, was he? I think this whole plan of, in this position, when he played bishop g5 and then knight e5, basically it's just not going anywhere. He must have somehow overestimated his chances on the king side. Well, who knows? But I think if the tournament, if he weren't leading the tournament, or he would have played differently. I think he would have played better. But anyway, congratulations to Levon Aronian. So final placings: Carlsen was first. Firuzja won against Duda today. What a recovery! Absolutely fantastic. So Carlsen, Firuzja, and then Aronian third. Firuzja won a packet of points. He's rises in the world rankings. I think he's number 17 now. And the other big winner was Aronian, who moves up to number 6 in the world. So there we go. Hope you enjoyed the coverage. There's more coming on the PowerPlayChess channel soon. And, well, do check out all the hundreds of videos there already. Thanks for watching.